Welcome to the Clear Lens podcast with me, Audrey Kissan. I hope this will be a place where you can get clarity on what's really going on in the world. We're at an inflection point, and it is pretty clear that bias and misinformation are eroding the public's trust in news media. It can be so tempting to tune out, but I really hope you don't. I hope you tune in here instead. I hope you listen in on the chats I'll be having with experts, leaders and advocates who really are passionate about giving you more clarity. Clarity on important issues facing us all today.
Daragh, thank you so much for coming back to have a chat with me.
Good to see you again.
Yeah. So the world is a bit upside down again in different ways. So we've barely started off the year and the US has struck a sovereign state, kidnapped its head of state, and told the world that it intends to take it over and run the country. Coincidence that it happens to have the most oil reserves in the world, number one. Probably a coincidence that Netanyahu had visited the White House in the days leading up to it to talk about a strike on Iran. Lots of things happening at once there, but the mainstream narrative seems to be that the US has liberated Venezuela from a dictator, and that while, they regret that it hasn't happened in the way that would have been ideal, which would have been, a peaceful transition, that ultimately good can come of it, because now Venezuela can go back to the people. So you've had the ripping up of international law, absolute ripping up of, the UN Charter, Chapter 1 and 2, about, the sovereignty of states. And we seem to have the leaders of, the democratic nations of the West saying, oh, regrettable, but fine, we'll work with it. What's going on? Why now? Why now? Why is Venezuela being attacked now?
Yeah, I mean, like as you say, there's a big kind of mixture of things all happening at the same time, and this sort of combination of a lot of different sort of movements and interests, all I think just kind of coming together at once. So I think like the first thing to maybe look at is like in general, since Trump was elected, his sort of rhetoric has all been really around sort of securing the Americas as a whole, including Greenland, right? So
Yeah.
kind of the first thing he kind of said coming into power was that Greenland was going to be theirs. He reiterated this just last night. He talked about Canada even becoming the 52nd state. He talked about Mexico becoming part of the US. And even amidst this invasion, he's saying that like Gustave Petro, the Colombian president, has to watch his ass. You see Senator Kinsey and Trump saying like Cuba's days are numbered, 2026.
There's a senile man in charge of Cuba, I heard. Is that right?
Yeah.
Apparently there's a senile man in charge of Cuba.
Yeah. Yeah.
That needs to be sorted out. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the rhetoric. And then now, of course, with Venezuela, I mean, this has been an ongoing regime change operation since really 2001. This has been sort of framed by a lot of people as a sort of like strategic retreat in some ways, now that they've sort of realized that the sort of economic hegemony that they have over the world is coming to an end now, with the likes of China rising, with Russia being able to essentially defeat the sort of Western-backed powers in Ukraine. So that's kind of one part of it, and this sort of going back to the Monroe Doctrine, that Trump is calling it the Donroe Doctrine, of kind of securing the Americas to make sure that their whole backyard is in check, because they have a case now of, on their doorstep having, several somewhat left-wing governments who are threatening to have control over their own resources and trying to reorient their economic policy towards their own
So
development rather
just
than US.
before you go on there, Daragh, like you're saying that basically these countries are trying to assert their own sovereignty and be in charge of their own economic affairs and their resources, but the Monroe Doctrine runs totally contrary to that. And just an explainer of what the Monroe Doctrine is, this is a doctrine that basically entitles the US to the resources of Latin America and the control. Is that right? Because people won't be aware of that.
Yeah, exactly. So this goes back, I mean, like almost 200 years now. But yeah, that's essentially what it's about. And you even hear in Trump's language, like he's talking about oil under Venezuela as being theirs. Like it's
Yes, and he's
not,
not
it's
even being shy
their oil.
about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's oil that Venezuela stole from them, right?
Yes.
That's how he
Yeah.
frames it. It's theirs. So this is sort of kind of the big sort of economic shift that's happening now is that they need to shore up the whole continent. And there's a few kind of different things all happening at the same time as to the why of that, right? Well,
Mhm.
Venezuela have 20% of the global oil reserves that are known. And now as we kind of embrace the continuation of exponential economic growth amidst environmental collapse, resource scarcity. You have the massive expansion of AI, which is incredibly energy hungry. You have
Mhm.
the real possibility now of global conflict, and that is also then in combination with the sort of powers of the big sort of three industries of fossil fuel corporations, technology companies, and military industrial complex, all of
Mhm.
which require a huge amount of energy, as well as rare earth minerals, etc., that Latin America are very rich in.
Yes.
And so you have those kind of things happening at the same time. Um,
Mhm.
then there, for me, the sort of big scale up of the escalations towards Venezuela. When did fishermen on Venezuelan boats start being bombed? Was really in the midst of the Epstein files being released.
Yeah.
So many speculate that this is also a big distraction from the Epstein files as a whole. And these
Mhm.
Epstein files are very obviously being used by the CIA and Mossad to sort of control the US government in terms of making these decisions. Trump is obviously heavily compromised by these.
Yes.
So there's likely a sort of
But is Trump not Christian? Is he not a holy man? Because he's got like, you know what I mean? I mean, is he not very holy? Because he's got a huge base of Christian fundamentalists. So that's really at odds with that, isn't it?
You would think so. You would think so. But maybe if you look at the more sort of outwardly holy somebody proclaims to be, maybe the more likely they might be to be engaged in
Yeah,
this
maybe they
sort of
might just
activity.
be using it, do you think, as a
They
map?
might. I mean, men
Yeah.
often tend to find God in the midst of rape scandals, actually. If you don't need to look too far at the
Russell Brand,
what's a
he's
brand,
found
Conor
Jesus.
McGregor. I mean, like
Conor
it's
McGregor is, I
yeah,
think he get married in the Vatican. He's gone
yeah,
really holy as well.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
he's
yeah,
all about the other person. He's compassion first kind of a person. He's, God-fearing
yeah,
Jesus. So
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So the Epstein files and how Trump is compromised.
Yeah, because really to me, like probably the biggest threat to the US empire today is it's a mixture of things, but like firstly is perhaps internal because the Epstein file from the right, because the
Mm,
Epstein files were actually something that the right of America were typically more preoccupied with than the left were for whatever reason that was. Or I say the left, like there's not really a major left in the US, but it's the
yeah,
liberals, let's say.
yeah,
And then you also have now on the right significant resistance to the realization that the United States government is being somewhat controlled by Israel, right?
yes,
And
yeah.
that these two things are very linked.
And Marjorie Taylor Greene kind of seems to be the face of that opposition, the former, staunch MAGA support for Trump that's dwindling in the face of the realization that, holy shit, our government is compromised. It's being puppeteered. It isn't America first, clearly. It is the interests of the elite who basically have them by the balls,
Mhm.
and can kind of get them to march to the tune of whatever beat they so wish.
Exactly.
And yeah, and you can
Yeah,
kind of,
Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, like these are sort of like far right figures who are now
Yes,
sort of the ones actually holding a far right government to account. It's kind of bizarre to
it
watch, but
is.
this
It
is
is. Yeah.
the
But we
reality.
welcome their opposition. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what we also have to remember is like, within the United States, the right-wing population are like armed to the teeth, It's like
Yes.
the sort of wet dream of a revolutionary to have a population that are realizing these things who also have access to guns. And they've sort of
Mhm.
been telling us, like, the whole world has sort of watched in disbelief at the sort of gun culture in the US for decades now, as like school shooting after school shooting has happened.
Yeah.
And the defense is typically that if there's a tyrannical government that don't represent the people, that the population will be armed and ready to be able to sort of overthrow this government. And there's sort of a shift in the general feeling of the armed population of the United States that this is happening. All of these pedophile conspiracy theories that were sort of mocked for quite some time,
Yeah.
actually, there's a lot of truth to these. People have now realized. So I think a big part of the timing was also a distraction from the Epstein files and to sort of distract people away, get people thinking about country first and America. And this is what war does, right? It
This
sort
is
of
what war does. Yeah.
galvanizes the sort of nationalism that they needed to reclaim.
Yes. And so whose interests are served best by what the US government has just done in Venezuela? Whose interests are being served and whose interests aren't being served? What's happening?
So the big obvious one, and this is like, even in Donald Trump's own words, are the fossil fuel companies, right?
Yeah.
Like even their whole sort of fake narrative that they put a bit of effort into trying to sort of spread. It was about sort of narco trafficking and narco terrorism and all the rest.
Mhm.
Even
Mhm.
though this is completely um like contradicted by their own drug enforcement agencies research in 2024, including the UN drug enforcement. Like all of these reports.
Very few like proper bodies that have looked at the evidence for that claim are supporting that claim. Are we
Yeah,
right about that?
the
It's
US's own report, it doesn't even mention Venezuela,
That's right. So because you have Micheál Martin parroting that
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
his statement today, but just for the record, there is no evidence anywhere that you will find on any official document that supports the claim that he was a narcotics.
Yeah, even the US's own institutions, they don't even mention Venezuela,
Right.
right?
So should we get that message to Micheál Martin if we could? If
I'm sure he
right.
knows. I'm sure he knows. I think
Okay.
like he's
Yeah.
kind of just parrots whatever he's told to.
Right.
And I
That's
mean,
oil.
the
Sorry.
contradiction at the same time is what has just happened is Trump has actually pardoned the Honduras leader, ex-leader. I don't know if you saw this. He was
Yeah.
a convicted narco trafficker. He's on record saying he was going to, I can't remember the exact words, but basically like shovel cocaine up the gringos' noses. He was like
That's
actually
crazy.
importing cocaine into the United States, and he's just been pardoned because he's now, just another one of these puppets in a country on the United States.
Maybe he found God.
Maybe, God, maybe that
Maybe he's going to be
typically
like,
enough
in the Christian fold, like the holy man Trump. Maybe.
would be the case. But anyway, it's like, these two things happening right at the same
Yeah.
time. It's sort of like, okay, and that's a benefit of having Trump in power is like the propaganda is very easy to see through, at least now.
Yeah, it is. It's
It's all
much
kind of out in
easier.
the open where they kind of just don't even bother anymore. So
Yeah.
the fossil fuel interests are the main ones. Obviously, Venezuela having 20% of the global oil reserves, and the sort of Venezuela right-wing opposition. So if you look at the likes of Machado, right? So she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize
That's right. Very peaceful
amidst calling
to
for an
organize
invasion
a
of her
coup
own
on your
country.
government. Yeah.
Yeah. And she also comes from a fossil fuel family. Her family,
Oh,
yeah,
that's interesting.
her family were co-founders of basically the energy company responsible for the electricity of Caracas. And same thing of her, there's other figures on the sort of fascist right of Venezuela, including Lopez and a
Mhm.
few others who you sort of hear in the rhetoric around Venezuela opposition. These two people were both implicated, caught red-handed in the coup of Hugo Chavez in 2002, right?
Right.
Machado caught on record lying. She said she was just trying to sign into the presidential palace. She signed a famous decree essentially legitimizing the US-backed coup of Chavez that was overruled only because the Venezuelan people stood up and said no to this illegal coup.
Sorry,
She
Daragh, just before we go forward with that, just to explain quickly
Mm,
what happened to the oil companies that her family formerly, had full control over.
mhm.
If they were nationalized when Chavez came to power in
Yes.
1991.
So her family specifically, I mean, so there's in Venezuela, this energy company, they were actually sold off already to a US owned company.
Right.
And with Lopez's family, he's like another one of the key members of the Venezuela right. His family were within actually the state-owned company, the same one that exists today, but there was a lot of sort of intermingling between the big fossil fuel companies, in particular Chevron and ExxonMobil are the two big ones.
Yeah.
And then you had these over time, they were nationalized. They weren't confiscated. Like it wasn't like a case of a hostile takeover. They were actually just bought over by the government in a legal transaction.
Mhm.
So this process happened from there was a hydrocarbon deal signed by Chavez in 2001, and that was sort of the beginning of the regime change operations in Venezuela because it was really this that threatened these fossil fuel interests.
Yes.
So if you look at Latin American history in particular, but actually the history of the world, going back particularly since World War II, anytime a government has tried to reorient their resources towards the well-being of their own people, they faced a coup, backed
Mhm.
by the US.
Yes.
So with this, so this goes back like a long way. So like from going back to the 50s, I mean, the famous example would be even Iran when they tried to nationalize their oil industry, which belonged to essentially British Petroleum, overthrown by the
Yeah.
CIA and MI6. In Guatemala in the 50s, you had Arbenz. In Brazil in the 60s, you had Goulart. You had then Allende in Chile in the 70s. You had Bolivia, Torres in the 70s. You had essentially Eva Morales even in 2019 because of lithium. Elon Musk famously tweeted, "We will coup whoever we want.
Whoever we want,
Deal
deal
with
with
it,"
it.
you
Deal
know?
with it. Yeah.
And so this is like just the general strategy, and like, Venezuela is no exceptional case to this. That's why it kind of is somewhat frustrating for people to say, oh, just listen to the Venezuelans and whatever,
That it's somehow unique, and in this case, it's actually warranted. And the US has the right motivations for doing this that aren't completely related to its theft of Venezuela's resources.
yeah.
It's bizarre that people don't see that clearly, given the clear, like you've just named them off. You need, and that's not even an exhaustive list. That
No, there's far more I'm
there's
forgetting.
far more.
And
Um,
basically, so these interests, and regardless, it's not always fossil fuel interests. Like in
yeah.
many cases, it's like agribusiness. In many cases, it's minerals, and it can change.
It was a system change in Venezuela that aimed to, nationalize the wealth of the nation. And that obviously ran completely contrary to the interests of the elite, who were wealthiest from Venezuela's ample natural resources. And
Yeah.
they have had a monopoly on that. And that ended with the Bolivarian Revolution, with the election of Chavez. So you have huge opposition to that. Huge, enormous opposition. And it isn't, I suppose it's a very well supported opposition, because obviously the US is going to support the opposition of that because it runs totally contrary to the US's hyper-capitalist, imperialist, and it's, yeah, it goes without saying.
Yeah. And
So
these
how did it
US
start?
interests,
Yeah.
so also with the likes of Machado, so like she has been like again on record as taking money from US interests as far back as 2002. The NGO she founded called Sumate, which was meant to be an election transparency NGO, as it's framed, they're fully
Mhm.
funded by the United States
Oh, yes.
and
Yeah,
have been for
sounds legit.
decades. You know? And it's this
Mm.
same NGO, just to go back to what you're saying in terms
So
of,
sorry now, they're funded by the US, and the US has admitted, and we know has made several coup attempts on Venezuela.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
the same entity that has made the coup attempts probably isn't the most independent force in
No.
that equation. And maybe if they really wanted to secure the integrity of democratic elections, they might probably choose a better third party country to oversee that rather than the country that attempted numerous coups on it. What do you think?
You would think so, but yeah, fully from the US National Endowment for Democracy Fund, and it's NGO. If you look at the even the Wikipedia page of the 2024 elections in
Yeah,
Venezuela that were like stolen, robbed, like, we don't know if they were or not. Nobody knows. That's the point.
yeah.
But it's this same NGO set up by someone who was caught red-handed in the 2002 coup and has been active in trying to achieve regime change, not through democracy, since that point, is one of the NGOs that are being named as this sort of transparency election NGO.
So again, like if they really wanted to prove the integrity of people's motivations, they might have chosen someone different to a woman who had been caught out in a coup attempt previous to that.
Yeah, she was charged like with treason, you know,
She was
like,
right,
and
okay.
fought. And even her
Um,
own election transparency NGO couldn't
defended.
paint the elections as undemocratic as far back as 2004. You know, she even admitted this herself.
So the long and short of it is that we're not here to say that they were or were not the elect. Like no one can kind of really conclusively say. The opposition will say that they have conclusive proof, and that proof is accepted by, you know, the European Union. It is accepted by the US as solid proof. It was a very highly orchestrated campaign. I'll just briefly explain what it was. 600,000 volunteers were divided into 60,000 groups of 10. They manned polling stations all across Venezuela. Venezuela has an electronic voting system. At the end of the day, where all the votes have been cast, there's a printout, and each of these machines has a QR code. The opposition say that they intercepted all of these printouts in about 80% of polling stations, right? And this is how they say that they can conclusively prove. Now, you can talk all day about the funding you would need to get 600,000 volunteers organized to that level. That is, I've never heard the likes of it. I've never heard the likes of organization like that. An operation as sophisticated from volunteers. But look, let's go with that. The Wall Street Journal stood over it and said, yes, this is legit. And then Maduro would say that there was hackers. And so there is, you know, there is a group that takes credit for hacking Venezuela. I can't think of the name of it offhand, but they use the hashtag #OpVenezuela. We know that the CIA has cyber attacked the Venezuelan government architecture on, you know, many times. So it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. And that mess that, you know, I don't know if it's ever possible to get full clarity on it because the trust is totally depleted everywhere. It comes on the heels of previous coup attempts. And I suppose maybe our best way to look at this is to zoom out and to look at a pattern over time rather than the intricacies of one very, very strange, peculiar and extraordinary incident
Yeah.
surrounding that election.
Exactly. And in Venezuela, since Chavez came to power, again, by election, I was just looking kind of back at all of the different elections that happened. I think there's been about 20, and 18 have been won by the sort of Chavismo movement, and then two have been won by the right, represented by the likes of Machado. Every single one of the 18 elections that Machado and her group lost, they disputed, you know, they tried to, and
that's very interesting, Daragh. They disputed
installed
all elections that they lost.
and tried to basically overthrow the government through very undemocratic means on many occasions. There was the coup in 2002. There was mass violent protests 2014. There was another president that was actually an interim president recognized by governments like the United States, by the UK and others. in 2019, Guaido, who was kind of just like forgotten about and left in the past a little bit. But, you know, all of these were illegitimate attempts to basically overthrow a democratic process, delegitimize a democratic process. So when you look at 2024, you know, who knows what happened? But
Yeah.
like, if you cry wolf enough times, I think it's fair enough to just say, why do we believe you the 19th
This time,
You
why do
know?
we believe you this time? Yeah, with your big bag of evidence, considering your past. It's like exactly as you say, the boy who cried wolf. Bit like January 6th, her behavior. So maybe her and Trump kind of saw eye to eye on that, you know, when he thought he was robbed and he had the
Mm.
Capitol stormed.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but these are the defenders of democracy.
Hmm.
These are the defenders of democracy.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of what this is, there's no doubt that there is a divide in terms of the narrative here. Venezuela was absolutely immiserated via sanctions. We're going to talk just briefly now about the socioeconomic picture before, just before Chavez came into power, afterwards, then what happened. And how, because of, I suppose, what was early success for Chavez, in terms of redistributing wealth and reducing poverty in Venezuela, serious punishment was dished out by the US in sanctions. Now, a lot of conversations are happening around the destruction economically of Venezuela, without mention of sanctions, which I find extraordinary. I find extraordinary to any serious journalist, to any serious political commentator, how they could actually keep a straight face and talk about the mess that was created inside of Venezuela while strategically omitting the single biggest factor, which are US sanctions. We can talk about this. So if we begin first with Chavez, what his coming to power achieved for the, you know, poorer parts of the Venezuelan population up until, I suppose, recently, and Maduro.
Yeah. So basically with Chavez, what happened was it kind of followed a decade or longer of kind of a complete lack of any sort of political integrity in the country. And Chavez kind of rode this wave into power as a sort of voice for the working class. So he inherited a country that had a poverty rate of about 50% in 1999.
Wow.
And within a decade or so, he'd halved that. Or I say he, but it was really a sort of revolutionary process. So his kind of movement was like known as the Bolivarian process, the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simon Bolivar. So with that, there was like huge gains made in the first decade under his authority, and this obviously is a very scary thing for sort of rich Western liberal democracies when this sort of progress is made this quickly. So you see extreme poverty go from about 25% to about 7 or 8% in
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, and you see like infant mortality down by about a third. You see adult literacy rise up to close to 99%, and you see like Human Development Index, which doesn't even do justice to Global South countries because it factors in GDP. But increase up to about 0.8, which is about like Mexico today or a lot of Eastern European countries. So at the same time, you saw a huge rollout of schools, health clinics, etc., in rural areas that had been more or less kind of completely abandoned up until this point. And you see huge then redistributions of wealth, primarily from oil revenue. So
And just before I continue, right, the opposition would at the time have called Chavez a dictator as well in different ways. And like, why would a dictator want to do that for the population? What kind of motivation would a dictator have for reducing poverty and for nationalizing resource? Like, wouldn't it be much easier for a corrupt person to side with his own interests? Or what?
Yeah, that's sort of just the language. I mean, like with Chavez being a dictator, and you hear like this rhetoric, even all of these Venezuelan people of like, oh, we've suffered under this dictatorship for 25 years, and
Yeah,
but it's actually not the case at all. It's just a system that they don't like because it doesn't benefit them in the same
yeah.
way that the sort of neo-colonial apparatus would have, because that system, it's sort of dependent on having a sort of comprador class within the country who act as kind of middlemen between the resources and the corporations.
Yeah.
They get very rich as a bonus or as an award for sort of acting as this middleman and ensuring that corporations have continued access to these resources. In this case, oil, which was maybe 90% plus of the revenues.
So they lost the freedom to do that, which I suppose that's where they're coming from when they call Chavez a dictator. You're no longer giving me my freedom to sell my country's resources to the highest bidder and get rich. And in a fair capitalist society, I should have the freedom to do that and get as rich as I want to get because, they're my resources if I
Mhm.
win them, because that's how the capitalist system works. And it's like, well, if that means that the wider population is immiserated because I'm hoarding wealth, they should just be stronger.
Yeah.
And, the winner takes it all.
Essentially, yeah. And like this is the sort of thing in terms of the global economy too. And like as well, that's why I kind of try and say is like Venezuela, it's not exceptional really if you kind of zoom out at all and look at this, because like this is how
Yeah.
most countries on earth are structured. And this, I mean, like how much is this really worth to the sort of ruling elites of the global north is like there was a great study done a while ago of like appropriation from global south to global north every year. And it's about 10 trillion dollars each year. So from 1990 to 2015 in this study, it was about $242 trillion. In 2015 alone, there would have been enough wealth expropriated from the global south to the global north to end extreme poverty 70 times over.
Wow.
Um, so when you kind of think about how much this is worth to a specific demographic of people, you then understand, okay, the reasons why, not only just in Venezuela, because of course Venezuela has huge oil resources, but
Mm,
how costly it is to set an example of a country being able to use their own resources for their own benefit, and for
yeah.
other countries basically not to get this idea either.
And
Because if you look at where extreme poverty has actually been reduced in the world over the last few decades and where it's increased, it's basically the countries, despite being under sanctions, you look at like the likes of even Venezuela, Cuba, you look at China, who has essentially ended extreme poverty in this period. You look at even in India, there was recently news about Kerala, which is a sort of autonomous region under
that's right.
sovereign control, ending extreme
Mm.
poverty. And these are just terrible examples to set because it starts giving people ideas about how a country can actually run and what
It'll give the working
reasons.
class people notions
Yeah.
above their stations. And if people catch wind of that, it's kind of very necessary to paint these regimes as, the dictatorships. Now, we're not saying that there wasn't chaos inside of Venezuela because of the attacks.
Mhm.
There was.
Yeah.
So we talked about how poverty was reduced. We talked about that.
Mm.
So the US intervention, and there was a recession as well. What happened to the Venezuelan economy after that initial good news for the general population?
Yeah, so there was a couple things that happened at the same time. The first was Chavez died. And Chavez was, for these reasons, incredibly popular in Venezuela, and for that reason, very difficult to overthrow, as they found out when they actually overthrew him for a few days and he was
Yes,
restored by the people.
by the people.
So when he died, this was kind of a perfect time for the regime change operations to scale up. What
Yeah,
also happened at the same time was global oil prices pretty much halved within the first couple of years and actually went down even further. So when Chavez died, oil prices were up at about $105 per barrel, and they decreased to about $35 per barrel in the next few years. So Chavez's economy, like, it wasn't like a socialist economy per se. Even it's even described by, I was listening to a woman, Kira Pascual Marquina is her name. She writes a lot about Venezuela. She's living there within a commune in Venezuela, and she described it as actually a rentier capitalist state, where it's essentially just a high degree of redistribution from oil profits. So that sort of spending power was immediately reduced. What happened then at the same time, you have 2014, where you have these same sort of far right, incredibly wealthy agitators like Machado and Lopez stirring up mass
They're going to
protests in
capitalize,
2014.
literally capitalize on that weakness.
Yeah, and then you have in 2015 Obama saying that Venezuela, for some reason he didn't specify, but we're like basically a serious threat to US security, and like kind of painted this as like somewhat of an emergency. And this was then the introduction of the kind of beginning of then these scale up of sanctions, which started around then, but severely scaled up across different presidencies until Trump put the sort of maximum pressure on. But something with the word sanctions, and this is again something that I've kind of thought a bit more about only through listening to people in Venezuela. And they say we don't like this word sanctions, because sanctions sort of implies that there's like a level of legality, that there's like a level of kind of harmlessness, that they're not violent. But actually, in this case, like, there's no international governing body like the UN. They're the only ones who, in theory, have the legal right to put sanctions on a country, right? In this case, it's just the United States that decided to put these sanctions on Venezuela. And that's why Venezuelan people, they would refer to them as violent coercive measures, that are directed towards regime change. And regime change, not only in terms of a who, but like the system as a whole, right? So what did this do is basically like destroy the sort of progress that had been made under the Bolivarian process and massively reduce living standards in the country.
Yeah, and so, just in terms of sanctions, Sarah, what it means to the everyday person, it always affects the poorest people, of course. The wealthiest people, the opposition, are unaffected by sanctions because they have either fled with their enormous wealth into very, very comfortable situations, either in Miami or in other parts of the world. Not all. It wasn't just the elite that fled. An awful lot of people left when conditions got really bad. Of course they did, a huge amount of immigration. But the sanctions and the impact, what does it mean? What does it mean for Venezuelan trade? What does it mean for medicines that are coming in for people who are seriously ill? What does it mean for food? What does it, like when a country is sanctioned, what does it do to the country outside of that country? It cripples that country, doesn't it? It prevents it from trading in the main with any other US allies. Is that right? Is it that extensive?
Exactly. It depends on like what the type of sanctions are. So the sanctions typically they're kind of scaled up over time. They'll start with sanctioning like specific people, let's say, and then they will scale up towards like sort of maximum pressure, which means that no country, no company, no insurance firm can do business with this country in any way, or else they'll lose access to the US market, to their banks, to their ability to trade as a whole. But just to go back a tiny bit, just as you're kind of referring to who these sanctions most impact. And you're right in saying that they really impact first and foremost the most vulnerable people. So there was a great study done in The Lancet recently, and they showed that sanctions from 1970 to 2021, they were responsible for at least 38 million excess deaths. So actually far more violent than any war in this period. And
that's important. Sanctions are more violent and are responsible for the deaths of more people than more bombs.
Yeah.
That's not common knowledge. Yeah, sorry, go
Yeah.
on.
And the kind of best example for this, and it's also a good example of this general strategy, is if you look at Iraq in the 90s, where the embargo on Iraq after the Gulf War killed about 2 million people. And that was before the invasion under false pretenses of weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. And with this, even by the mid 90s, there was a UN report which showed that over 500,000 children had been killed because of these sanctions.
Half a
And
million Iraqi
when
children.
asked about this, Madeleine Albrighton, US politician who was in charge of these at the time, basically just said the price is worth it, right? And then when we kind of look at other places and we kind of see this general strategy is like first you kind of destroy the economy with sanctions. That's what,
Divide it within and have people fighting and blaming each other as well,
yeah,
blaming the government, because obviously it creates an absolute misery
yeah.
and fighting, and nothing is at harmony in a country under sanction to that degree. It's on its knees.
Yeah, people are starving to death. People are dying on hospital beds because they don't have medical equipment. People don't have food, water, etc. Factories close down because they don't have parts, and of course, people look to the government. They say, look, we
Absolutely.
blame
What
the
have you
government.
done? Why are we under sanction? What have you done to displease or diplomatically or whatever it is? So the US, which has imposed these sanctions, has succeeded to basically divide it from within, divide and conquer, and swoop in as a savior of a crisis it committed.
Exactly. And in Venezuela's case, even there was a study done across 2017, 2018, done by a US economist, Jeffrey Sachs. And he estimated that about 40,000 people died in 2017 alone, just because of sanctions, right? And this is a way of basically just destroying, de-developing, and stirring unrest within a country. The same thing that they've been doing to Iran at the same time, like in a very mirrored strategy. And basically, the mechanism through which the US can do this so unilaterally is because of the US dollar being the global reserve currency.
Yes, reserve currency. And we just explain what the reserve currency is and the power it gives the US financially over the world.
So basically, the US dollar being the global reserve currency, it just kind of means it's like the currency that has to be held basically by every country on earth if they want to do international trade. So the US.
So if you need the dollar to make money from international trade as a country, you need to trade in this currency. So
Yeah.
if you cannot, because you're under sanction, you cannot trade internationally.
Pretty much. There's kind of backdoor ways that countries have to try and engage in to be able to still try and import export the kind of basics, but it makes it far more difficult and far more expensive, and in some cases impossible to do.
It's like, if I could just use a simple analogy, it's like making someone unemployed. It's kind of getting rid of their means to earn a livelihood. If you were talking about that in an international context. It's like you're gone, you're cut, you're not making any money.
Pay their money. Like, and then you're left basically to barter. Like that's the equivalent on the day-to-day.
Can I do you a favor for you, because I can't actually trade in this currency.
So for example, Venezuela and Cuba would be sending doctors to Venezuela and Venezuela would be sending oil to Cuba. That's like an actual case of what was happening between the two countries.
Yeah, just to give people a really solid sense of just how, what's the word, I suppose, rudderless it leaves a country in terms of economically being able to survive.
Yeah, and that's kind of what's also meant as well that Venezuela, there's kind of this well-publicized chart that's kind of gone around on social media in the last few days, and it shows oil reserves relative to oil exports and oil refinement. And it's the same thing in Iran and Venezuela now, is despite having the first and maybe fourth largest oil reserves on the planet, neither of them are actually able to refine their oil because of these sanctions and because of their inability to sell it. So even if they were able to refine it, which they can't because they can't get access to the machinery and equipment necessary to do so, but even the small amounts they are able to, then they have to sell on the black market at heavily discounted prices as well. So even what they are able to get is like a
People
ton.
can take advantage of their lack of ability to be able to trade openly and fairly. They're like, look, you're desperate. You're going to have to take what I give you because you don't have any leverage here.
Yeah, and you have to be paying middlemen and smugglers and all the rest. And like actually one of the boats that the United States essentially took over in one of these pirate operations of the last few weeks was Venezuelan oil heading to Cuba.
Yes, yeah.
And with this
But it
then,
wasn't enough to sanction them. They're like, no, we're also going to stop you trying to get around our sanctions. We're going to destroy you on every level.
yeah, which is completely illegal as well, again.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah.
Yeah. And basically, so this power that the US have in terms of being the global reserve currency, this is it's been sort of evolving since World War II. Before that, it had been the British pound. After World War II, it kind of became the US dollar backed in the gold standard. And then once countries started to request their debt in gold from the United States, they weren't able to pay it back. So they had to end the gold standard, mostly because of their military interventions across the world. And they had basically overspent massively on their military, and they couldn't pay any of these debts in gold. So this is when they shift to the fiat currency standard. And what the sort of backing of the dollar then became was oil. So in this period, so it was really kind of late 60s, early 70s, where you see this shift from gold standards to what's called the petrodollar.
The petrodollar. Okay. That's very clear. Yeah. Okay.
So what was happening at the time is you saw these liberation movements happening across the global south in particular, where people were going through this process of decolonization, and they were starting to take control over their resources and try and orient their economies towards the well-being of their own populations. So what did this do is firstly threaten the whole world order and this relationship of unequal exchange, which we were talking about earlier, to the process of about $10 trillion per year. And it threatened the power structures within countries, and in particular in the Arab world at this time, which is, you know, the center of the world in terms of trade routes and also the largest known oil reserves as like a block in
Collective. Yeah.
So at this time, you saw big nationalizations of trade routes. So, for example, the Suez Canal in Egypt in the 50s under Nasser. You saw nationalization of the oil industries happening at the same time. And the scariest part of it was this pan-Arab movement, a revolutionary movement to unite the Arab world under socialist-led governance. So for the Gulf monarchies, this was incredibly scary. For US corporate interests, this was incredibly scary. So what did they do was essentially sign an agreement that the US would prop up the monarchies in the Gulf countries in exchange for the Gulf countries only selling oil in dollars. And what did that mean was that because oil is the most traded commodity on earth and it's what every single country needs in order just to run their economy, it meant that basically every country on earth now had to hold US dollars, meaning that there's constant demand for US dollars. So when that's the case, so what restricts any country from just printing infinite amount of money is inflation. So when you are restricted to a small country or a national economy, you're limited to how much money you can print. When you have the whole planet essentially for your dollars to spread into, the
pool is so massive. The pool is so massive that you can print without distorting or disturbing the markets and create.
Exactly, because you know there's constant demand.
So in a nutshell, having a reserve, being the reserve currency, it means you have a money machine.
Yeah.
A magic money machine You can just keep printing. So if the US is running a trade deficit, it doesn't bloody matter because it is the reserve currency. It can just print as it pleases.
Exactly.
Essentially.
So, like, as long as their debt is in dollars, they can't go
Yeah.
bankrupt because they can print it. But every other country have to have dollars.
Mm,
That means they have a completely different playing field than what the US have in
yeah.
terms of their own monetary sovereignty, in terms of their trade relations, in terms of their ability to spend. And
Mhm.
this is kind of perhaps the biggest imbalance in the global economy that we see between the United States and the rest of the world. And this is what
Enormously.
they
Yeah.
weaponize in terms of sanctions and all of the,
So
they can cut countries off from the system.
they can. So this is why, Tara, this is why it's so important that the threat of Venezuela aligning with China and Russia in an alternative system,
Yeah.
BRICS, an alternative to the petrodollar, as you say, to trade in different currencies. That basically is an enormous threat to the US's hegemony, global. It's like, what do you think you're doing? I own you, Venezuela.
Yeah.
According to this doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, those resources are mine. That's my oil. How dare you think you can trade in an alternative currency to the dollar? So that was underway, and China and Russia and Venezuela were trading, and this is another huge factor that had to be by the US killed. That isn't going to stop, though, the likes of China and Russia and BRICS generally from continuing to counterbalance what is a toxic US hegemony in the world. And we're watching this play out in what we're seeing now in, these kind of military takeovers that are completely and utterly lawless. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They're so desperate. He's looking for Greenland. He's going to go after Canada. There's talks of Iran, and Iran is really, really strategic. Because just quickly, I suppose it's important to explain that attacks on Iran, that they have been, the 12-day war recently, but Netanyahu spoke about it on his recent visit in the US. Iran's biggest, I suppose, threat to the US, if the US attacks it, is to close the Strait of Hormuz. I can never say that properly. And that would disrupt the entire global economy. You could argue that that's why Venezuela is happening now and is being secured now ahead of another planned attack on Iran. And this is to kind of sew up and stitch up the world's economy and resources and its own power in the face of rising, I suppose, economic power from China and Russia. That's what's happening on an even kind of bigger level as well, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And like I tie that into a few other things at the same time. So with this exactly right, as you say, with China and Russia. So Russia, they have already been cut off from the SWIFT system.
That's right.
And people
Yeah,
assumed that would cripple them, and it didn't.
it didn't.
And there was
Yeah.
many things that were done to Russia and the Russian economy that were
I will just explain SWIFT quickly because we didn't explain that. SWIFT is the international payment system
yeah.
that allows people to trade in US dollars. So they were cut off from that. So yeah, okay.
Exactly. And basically with this, so they were cut off and they managed to survive it with actually much greater ease than was expected. And now China also have an alternative system to this called SIPS. So this to the US is another sign of sort of the end of their global hegemony over the global financial system. So they know this is happening, and even the Chinese SIPS system, like it's meant to be far more efficient, far more practical. It allows countries basically to trade in their own currencies. It's backed up in the Chinese yuan, and like
that sounds like a recipe for equality in the world, to trade in your own currency. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is being openly discussed with the BRICS countries as well. And this is like a seismic shift. It's not really talked about or reported on whatsoever in the global media as a whole, but this would really restrict the United States' ability to send how many trillions they want to Israel, to
Yeah.
Ukraine, to bail out Argentina for $40 billion. You know, they can essentially just do this and they can have their tentacles in every country on earth because of the privilege they have based on their ability to control the global financial system. And a good example of this recently was what they just did to Francesca Albanese, where they were just
Yes.
able to basically cut her off from the global financial system. And that means she can't do something as simple as book a hotel or have a credit card transaction or anything, you know?
Have her health insurance reimburse her.
Yeah. And this is sort of the power that they have and they've had now for quite some time. But what have the US been doing at the same time is like, again, since Trump came in, what was the kind of big thing that everyone was talking about? Tariffs. Yeah.
Mm.
And what were tariffs a proof of? Firstly, the control that US corporations and the US economy had over the economies of basically every country on earth to a certain extent. It limited any country's ability to be sovereign in any way, to take any sort of material stance against Israel, and it really showed that the power that they had was extremely far-reaching and something that the rest of the world were very afraid of. But what did it also do was teach the world that they needed to have a backup plan in some way.
Yes.
Especially when you see how sort of myopic and how basically masklessly evil, in particular, this empire and in particular, this establishment is. So that's meant a behind the scenes diversification that's been happening at the same time in terms of building up more diversified trading partners and at the same time payment systems and other
So
mechanisms to be able
what's
to
being
reduce
proven in the world is that countries can thrive, or not thrive, not in the case of Venezuela, but that China and Russia can help countries to find a route out of the restrictions of US sanctions. They can create an alternative world system.
Yeah, and
Whereby
that's kind of the big hope. I mean, for a lot of people, it's not necessarily that like Russia or China are like, you know,
saviors. Yeah,
exactly, you
no,
know,
they're not.
because they have
Yeah,
their
of
own interests and
course
like
they do.
they didn't really do anything to stop the genocide or do anything that people
No,
be hoped that they would to make the world a better
they're
place.
not intervening for the world's interests. They're
Yeah,
intervening for their
they're looking
own.
after themselves, but
But in the process, other countries' interests will be served.
exactly. So, like
Yeah.
any country that's sanctioned, like Iran or Venezuela, they were able to turn to Russia and China for help.
Yeah.
And another part of the timing with the kidnap of Maduro and the bombing of Venezuela was that actually there was Chinese representatives there the day before, likely
Yes.
talking about alternative payment systems and trying to exchange Venezuelan oil for
Yeah.
Chinese yuan and different things to be able to try and diversify away. And this action from the US was also a message to them to
A
say,
massive
this is
thing.
our backyard. This is our Monroe Doctrine 2.0 or whatever point oh at
Hmm.
this stage. And we are going to be in charge here, not you.
Yeah. Yeah. Off our turf.
Yeah.
And yeah, you'd imagine that there were even still some Chinese parts of the diplomatic team still in the country, still in
Yeah.
Caracas, as they struck them. So yeah, really aggressive, really brazen, very clear message. That's what's happening. And yeah, I mean, to bring it home to Ireland, and how and why we should be interested, or we should be following this and paying attention, is this wider global march towards militarization that we're seeing. We're seeing an intensification of it. We've just watched a live stream genocide. We're watching an ongoing live stream genocide with less footage because so many Palestinian journalists have been massacred. And the Western press insists on and portraying what's happening now as a ceasefire. But we can also see the ramping up of the war propaganda against Russia. We see the portrayal, the very cartoonish portrayal of Russia as the boogeyman, like we saw in that article the Irish Times published before Christmas in particular,
Mm,
literally with the red background and Putin's
mm,
face dominating over the top of Shannon Airport. What would
mm,
happen if Putin came and took over Shannon
mm,
Airport?
mm.
So we can see what's happening, you know, the very usual, you know, there's unidentified drones, speculation, speculation, speculation. It's never proven because,
Yeah,
you know, you need lies to get people to buy in to war. Now, I'm
yeah,
not saying that it is conclusive either way, but I'm saying that it is speculation.
yeah,
That there are drones in our airspace. It is speculation about undersea cables, and it's kind of getting people riled up. But what's happening in Ukraine has to be viewed through an imperial lens as well. When we look at various agreements, it is about what? It's about rare earth minerals. It's about using frozen Russian assets to reinvest in Ukraine. And then who's getting 50% of those profits? The US.
mhm,
Who's getting paid back for the weapons it provided Ukraine? The US. Who
mhm,
is benefiting financially from the devastation wrought on Ukraine? The US. And now
mhm,
the US has had enough of using its own funds. It has secured its interests in various deals, the mineral deals. And so now it's moving on to other spheres, other theaters of war, now that it has one of its, you know, biggest enemies really bogged down. And it wants Europe and NATO to take that over. So it's saying, look, we're leaving NATO. We only really ever set it up for Europe to kind of take it over. That was actually part of it. That was in a journal. I can't remember the name of the think tank. So Europe is starting to spend on defence, banging the drums of war, and that is coming home right here to Ireland. It's here
mhm.
and it's on our doorstep. We are shedding the last of what's left of our neutrality. The government is saying that it wants to get rid of the triple lock for sovereignty of all things. We're going to be serving imperial interests, mostly the working class Irish men. And whose interests are they going to be serving? Not their own, not their own. And I fear that the debate in Ireland is really lopsided. It's that we have been freeloading militarily, that are, you know, defence spending is a whole other separate conversation to the deployment of troops, which is what the triple lock is about. The triple lock basically means that our troops can be sent anywhere without a UN mandate. It frees them up to join any kind of illegal war. So this is what's happening, and it is happening at the behest, once again, of US dominance, because the US wants Russia to be sorted out via Europe and NATO, because it's busy elsewhere. And that might sound incredibly simplified and reductionist, but what do you agree? Do you think that's ultimately what's happening?
Yeah, it seems to be. I think like exactly right in terms of this whole Ukraine war. Like, you know, the US made a fortune out of this, you know, and it's been like a consistent
Mm,
strategy, I mean, of NATO since their existence. I mean, NATO, the EU, the IMF, World Bank,
yeah.
Israel, all created more or less at the same time by imperialist powers. And like the purpose of NATO and the European Union, really, first and foremost, was to stop the spread of communism through Europe. That was their
Mm,
sort of primary function. And when it comes to NATO, like NATO, it's a US proxy army, first and foremost. Like they control what decisions are made, regardless of any other sort of powers. And like
mhm.
the rhetoric really of the last few years, like whenever Trump has been speaking to a leader that's a NATO member, pretty much the first thing he says to them is, you need to get your GDP spending up to 5%.
That's right.
Like that's what
Yeah.
you need to do. Right. And the thing is with this is that like all of this money like it just goes directly to military industrial complex in the US. You know, this is where the vast majority of these weapons are actually made and where the money is all funneled to. And these interests that I mentioned earlier in terms of fossil fuels, the technology companies and military industrial complex, like these are the industries that need these rare earth minerals, particularly technology and defense, as it's
Mhm,
called, need these more than any other industry.
mhm,
So then when you see this sort of wealth transfer, firstly from working class up to elites through tax money is how these weapons are actually paid for.
Yeah.
And
So
then
that's what people don't understand, I think, in a very plain way, that these massive wealthy companies, they're ultimately, I call them welfare spongers, because they're funded through taxation. And you know, you talk about the unemployed people, you can give out all day about different things and ways. Ultimately, working people pay for taxation for social protection. But that's not what happens to tax revenue in a system that favors and prioritizes the wealth of a small few elite. So actually what happens is that the fat cats at the top become the welfare sponges. They're the ones that are actually sucking dry the tax revenue of a nation and impoverishing it. And it's just always it never ceases to blow my mind how the very people who are sponging like absolute parasites and deadbeats from the tax, the really hardworking population, they get to flip the narrative. They get to flip it. And they get to say that anyone who is calling for more investment in social protection, whether it be housing, whether it be health, that they, you know, shouldn't be looking for handouts. They shouldn't be looking for handouts. The very people who survive with their grants and their incentives and their like just that it blows my mind that the working class people don't see this clearly. And in Ireland, this transfer of wealth in the last budget, we saw a corporate giveaway. We saw a corporate giveaway in a country that has multiple crises unfolding, despite our wealth. And we also had, not just that, we had CETA. We had that really, really, really despicable, and I'm going to use the word treasonous bill. Because can we talk a bit about what that is and what it means?
So with that, in terms of firstly like corporate subsidies and like where this money goes, I always use the example of Elon Musk to my students as the richest man on earth and like soon to be like trillionaire status, and not one of his companies, from like Twitter to Tesla to Starlink to Neuralink to like all of these companies that he has, not one of them is profitable without subsidies. So funded by taxpayers, including SpaceX.
Sponger. He's a real,
Yet he's the richest man on earth without a profitable company. And then in terms of kind of say this CSAT, with this vote, so basically what did the government do is voted like in the middle of the night without any real
1 a.m. because everyone's awake and alert in December, and 1 a.m. for a vote. That's not shady at all.
And basically voted to allow corporate power to override democracy, like in a simple way. Basically, corporations can sue the government if their profits are threatened.
By government policy. Government policy, an example of which could be increasing the minimum wage. So
yeah, exactly. And this is something that's used. I mean, like it's something that's used around the world already. So basically, there's this like ISDS system, it's called, and it's basically built into a lot of trade agreements. And this is something already, like hundreds of billions of, again, taxpayer money is siphoned off to corporations through this.
Welfare sponges, the taxation sponges of the earth. They get all of the worker-based money.
And like in the middle of a climate crisis where like they've already said the 1.5 degree target is gone. 2 degrees is likely to be reached in the next 15 years. And like beyond that point, that's the kind of hard limit they gave to us. And like beyond that point, we're into like runaway apocalyptic climate change. And there's, I think, more than 20 open cases from corporations against governments ongoing today, or just actually registered last year alone, for governments trying to enact climate policies. And like, I think that just sums up the insanity of this
system.
law,
It's going to kill
especially in
us.
this time, you know? And it's the same thing, you know, we've chatted on previous podcasts about the Occupied Territories Bill, what was going on, why was it being stopped? And again, this would allow corporations to sue the Irish government for threatening their profits, you know? And it's like a complete capture of the government from corporate power that just allows the government to do absolutely nothing, as you say, from workers' rights to whether it's climate rights, whether it's trying to actually abide by international law. All
Yeah.
of these are subsumed to corporate profitability, you
Yeah.
know?
And doesn't it just show as well, Dara, I suppose, how unnatural a system it is, because it can't live in harmony with the laws of the earth, which is climate balance, because it is so extractive. It relies on continuous growth, which is totally unnatural. Nature isn't. Nature has seasons.
Yep.
You can't have continuous growth. Like, you see the madness of these capitalist systems. I think one really good example lately I saw was like trying to grow strawberries all year round with infrared red light. Apparently there was red light for people were seeing it in planes and wondering what the hell is that, and it was like, this is how we're growing strawberries. It's like we're forcing growth
Yeah.
constantly, without any regard for what is natural and what the earth needs. And
Yeah.
so right now we need to be drastically reducing our consumption of fossil fuels. They're doing the precise opposite.
Yeah. And it kind of, you know, I mean, if you look at the like latest state of the climate reports for the last couple of years, the first thing they've emphasized is that basically like infinite growth on a planet with finite resources is like a dangerous illusion. They refer to it as something along those lines. And as you mentioned with fossil fuels, this is like the one thing that like everyone understands, and no matter what you know about climate change, like fossil fuels, even the most uncontroversial climate scientist will tell you we need to phase out fossil fuels, right?
Yes.
And like again, this like to kind of circle back then to Venezuela, and when we're kind of talking about all of these interests, and again, it's the fossil fuel interests with $3 billion a day of profits for the last 50 years, and that are leading the charge on this to basically extract the largest oil reserves on Earth. And I haven't seen one bit of discourse that's even mentioned the scientific consensus that's to leave fossil fuels in the ground, because that's actually been completely forgotten and just moved beyond, because we're now so distracted with war and so distracted with all of these topics that they have us arguing over, of like migration or like identity politics or whatever else.
But ultimately, that is the catastrophe that's on the way, that they know is on the way. But rather than deal with it, they're just going to stitch up and secure, I guess, the resources that they can for.
And this is where the militarization comes in, and this is where you start to understand maybe a bit more the US strategy in terms of shoring up the Americas and then leaving the whole sort of eastern side of the world, from Europe to Russia down to Asia, Africa, to sort of just fight it out amongst each other. Because when we think of what this military spending is going to be about, yes, you have the threat of Russia, but what do we also know as a fact is that a large part of the planet is soon going to be uninhabitable. You're going to have billions of climate refugees. So this is another part of the anti-migrant sentiment, I think, that's often left out.
Yeah.
They're sort of desensitizing us. Firstly, we've talked about before, even with the genocide, even with other things, to mass death. They're already turning us against migrants. And then they're militarizing the borders as well as the general populations. And what is this doing is like militarizing sort of the eastern front of Europe, the borders of Europe on the outside, but also there's going to be huge internal dissent as we start to face greater resource scarcity. We're going to face a real threat in a future much nearer than we think of, do we allow the sort of parasites at the top to keep consuming in the way that they want to, or do we have a way of planning our economy amidst environmental breakdown that allows a somewhat equal distribution of resources, that allows us to deal with this situation in a way that actually makes sense, in a way that might be fair, and in a way that doesn't leave millions of people, billions of people, to essentially just die and starve or just kill each other, you know?
Yes, but there, like, this is where I just want to say and make a point here. When it comes to stopping the world as it is running now, the march towards militarization and the US, it's actually, it's not really people are so distracted with left and right conversations. It's actually about survival at this, key point. It's about the future. It's about securing a livable planet. It's about respect for human life. I mean, if people want to deny the evidence that we're on the cusp of a serious climate emergency, there has never been more carbon in the atmosphere. I'm learning all of this afresh. There have been times, I've all sorts of climate deniers whenever I post about this. The ice age is all I get. And as you have explained to me in really simple ways, there were more carbon sinks in the world at that time. The world had the ability to be able to balance and absorb carbon levels so that they don't exponentially rise. What is happening now is they're exponentially rising, and the depletion of carbon sinks like bogs and rainforests and all sorts is at a peak. So we're in this kind of perfect storm where no one's talking about climate urgency anymore. The world is militarizing. The superpowers are fighting it out for key resources. And we're not framing events like what we're seeing in Venezuela through those lenses. Like we're just not. We just think he was a dictator and he needed to be toppled. And now peace can be restored, and give peace a chance now. And it's incredibly naive. Like, no one is saying that Maduro was, or that he was not, like that there wasn't corruption, like in Venezuela or whatever. Of course, like it was a melting pot. It was under huge strain. Can you imagine the amount of paranoia? Can you imagine the amount of control that would have to have been imposed for a country under constant attack?
Yeah, but even like think of just the few things we've just mentioned in Ireland. Yeah, we've talked about like abandoning Irish neutrality when 3/4 of the population want Ireland to remain neutral. We mentioned the Occupied Territories Bill that they wouldn't enact. 3/4 of the population are in favor of this. The government themselves, when it comes to this CETA, on record even as saying that in a referendum it wouldn't pass. So like even this idea of democracy that we have is completely flawed in reality. And when you actually look at the US's allies around the world, like even as we did earlier with the Gulf monarchies, or we talked about like what democracy or sovereignty actually means nowadays, when every country on earth was essentially made to realize they don't have control over their own resources, they don't have control over their own foreign policy. So like we also need a kind of reset over what we mean by democracy and what we are actually striving to achieve in terms of democracy. And again, to kind of try and just circle it back to Venezuela again, in terms of like what this Bolivarian process is actually about and this path. And when there's a great series on Venezuela on Upstream podcast, and they have a couple of episodes that are around the communes in Venezuela. And the communes in Venezuela are part of this process where they have actually managed to, whatever about the sort of ideas of liberal democracy that we say, okay, you get to choose your oppressor every 4 years. We have like two parties that have been running the country for the last 100 years in Ireland. Same thing in the US, two-party system, offense and defense essentially of the same team. Yeah. And like what have they achieved in Venezuela, even under these sanctions, is a high degree of democracy around the things that actually matter within these communes. They have autonomous control through citizens' assemblies over their means of production, how they spend their day, what they want to work in, what they're going to orient their production towards. They control their own food sovereignty. And even under these crippling coercive measures, they've been able to spread these communes and actually have people making decisions from the grassroots level on the day-to-day running of their local economies that are oriented towards their general well-being,
And these communes, did you say that there's a specific Venezuelan journalist who writes about them and who lives in one, that maybe just for people listening?
Yeah, so I found her through basically this. There's a couple of them that did podcasts on the Upstream.
Upstream. So you can, yeah, we can hear from her in
Her
Upstream.
name is Kira Pascual Marquina, Cira, Pascual Marquina. And she talks actually, she has an episode herself on the sanctions as well. And she talks a lot about how these communes actually work, you know, and this is something that people are sort of rediscovering now, especially as the illusion of democracy has really faded in the last couple of years around the planet.
Mm.
And that this is sort of the next step of this Bolivarian process in Venezuela, where people do have real democracy at the grassroots, you know, and
At the grassroots.
Michael
Yeah.
Parenti, he says, he talks about democracy and he has a quote, I'm probably not going to get it right exactly, but what he kind of says is like the real crime of all of these leaders who are overthrown in coup attempts around the world from the United States is that they are using political democracy to achieve economic democracy. And I think
Mm.
that's sort of the true crime in the eyes of the United States over
Mhm.
what any global South leader is actually doing. And why? Because there's $10 trillion every year being expropriated from the global South. And that's what's threatened through economic democracy.
Yes. Economic democracy being in a very simple way, the grassroots distribution of wealth, like so that like these communes is a perfect example of that, where
Yeah.
wealth is is there for a community to manage on a local level, and it doesn't come centrally. Um, and it's funny that in a country where systems like that are in development, that is a country that would be called a dictatorship.
Yeah.
It kind of, yeah, it's very skillful the way they can do this, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um,
But I mean, that's the thing. And like we've watched that again throughout the genocide. Like who gets called the terrorists? You know, who gets
yeah.
dictators? And it's the
Mm.
deliberate strategy from the ruling elite is like, how do you flip these terms to a point where they can just be used as quick answers in like interviews where you can say they're terrorists, he's a dictator.
Yes, they're just labels. They're
Also,
very
so
quick
they lose
labels.
their
Yeah.
meaning completely. That's
Mm.
kind of another part of the strategy is like, how do we make this word just lose all of its sense, you know?
Yes, how do we make exactly? Because, like we were saying before, it's like Hamas are terrorists. No one ever wants to talk about who Hamas are, why they exist, where they come from, and the conditions that created it, the injustice, the Nakba. We're never going to hear about the Nakba in any article about
Yeah.
what has happened in Palestine, for example.
Mm.
The strategic omission of vital context
Yeah.
in the formation of the average person's worldview, to the point where they genuinely are blinded to the context. And it takes effort to inform yourself because the effort is being made to keep you with a specific worldview that aligns in such a way to keep you compliant.
Yeah.
Because if you were to realize your power, if we were to realize our power, it is over. Like it is over for the top 1-5% and whatever percentage of compradors orbit that top percentage.
Yeah.
So it's kind of vital that the working class people don't come to full awareness and don't have the vital context of the world. And that's the part that can be very disillusioning when talking about a subject like this from people who have been, I suppose, following the events in Palestine, like how we could ever view anything other than the world through this lens of a tiny, corrupt elite siphoning wealth from the entire population of the world, really, essentially, because they do it domestically as much as they do it not as much, but it's happening domestically as well.
Yeah.
So that's my hope, is that people at least understand that there's nuance, that they should always look out for, like I just said there, the strategic omission of context.
Yeah.
In their news, diversify their news sources, and really just kind of understand the science in terms of the climate of what's ahead for us. who's going to be looking out for whose interests when the worst of the climate emergency starts? Do you think it's going to be the people who are genociding people in the Middle East? Do you think it's going to be the same people who have just handed more power to corporations over the population? And people just have to get a bit smart and ask those questions. Just ask them. Yeah, and see where it leads you. So I think maybe to finish it off, Daragh, how do you want to round it off? What's ahead, maybe? In the year ahead, it's been a crazy start. I think it's probably going to set a pace for the rest of the year. I don't think we're going to have many lulls in the military drama this year, for example. What do you think?
Yeah, I think like the things that we most have to realize, like first and foremost, I think is like given everything we've watched in the last few years, everything that the media and politicians are telling us is that you need to really just question everything.
Yes.
Every single thing has to be questioned. Everything you thought you knew about the world has to be questioned. And just starting with, I don't know, is a good place to start. But just to say, I'm not just going to parrot what mainstream media tell me because we've watched the complete dissonance between reality and rhetoric over
we have seen that. Yeah, we have seen that.
The second of which I think has to be that like we live in a globalized economy, that our futures are inherently tied together under the survival of our species and the well-being of our planet, and that as long as the US empire exists, humanity in the long run doesn't.
Yeah.
And that when we look around the world and we look at every single experiment that there's been towards progress and human liberation, it's been the US empire that's ended it for the last 70 years straight. And we see this happening again now, is a country that's tried to follow its own route, tried to pursue its own sovereignty and actually take control over their own resources for the benefit of their own people. This is the real crime, right? So that we need to start seriously questioning and challenging US power, hard and soft power. And we have to be in solidarity with all of those that are under the thumb of US oppression. Yeah. So we see like in the last couple of years that like the focus has been on Israel and trying to isolate Israel, and Israel are often called the tip of the imperial spear.
Yeah.
We have to then say who's holding the spear and how can we meaningfully challenge them in our own contexts.
Yes. Yeah. And look, we have our work cut out for ourselves, especially in Ireland, which is, the US is the savior. It's very socially risky in certain circles to even criticize the US, but we've got to kind of normalize at least broaching those conversations in a serious way with just data and with just what we've seen, and we need to kind of hurry up about it. And
the positive front, it's never been easier now that Trump is there and it's so blatant.
Yeah, but also the US system, not just Trump. Because Kamala Harris would be doing this, but she'd be doing it with a girl boss branding. Do you know what I mean? And Obama would have too, the beautiful orator who was massacring people with drones as they attended weddings in the Middle East. So, we get different brands of the same shite, but it is easier with the Trump brand. That's Daragh, thanks so much. We'll do this again soon because I'm sure that in the next few days alone, the world is going to change drastically again, because that's just the pace of it now.
Thank you so much again, Audrey. Lovely to chat to you again. And chat soon.
You too.